Merhaba, hoş geldiniz. Hello and welcome. Tonight we have a special double Who's in Town. We normally have these one by one, but we were lucky that Rajeev Thakker, Jennifer Bruton Farah, and Kamal Farah are here together on a workshop they're doing with Studio-X Istanbul. So we asked them to share a bit of their recent researches on the stage here at the Walk-in Cinema, and Rajeev Thakker will be talking about the experiences at Studio-X Mumbai, which is an initiative by Columbia University. And Jennifer, Jenny and Kamal will be talking a little bit about their research on cities as adaptive technologies that they, as far as I understand, work at the MIT Media Lab as part of Changing Places group. The way we will run will be that Rajeev will do his presentation first, and then there will be a Q&A part, which I think is more important than just him telling us what they're doing, but us asking about what's going on at Studio-X Mumbai. And then we will need a few minutes to make another adjustment to invite Jenny and Kamal on the stage. And we will have time, sure, to also do a Q&A after their talk on the cities as adaptive technologies. Thank you for coming. And I think, Rajeev, we can start if you like. Thank you.
Hello. Good evening. Can you all hear me? Okay. I wanted to thank SALT for inviting us tonight to speak to you. There was a brief introduction of who I am, but basically I'm an architect, and I'm also a curator for Columbia University GSAP's Studio-X Mumbai program. It's interesting to talk about urban space, public space, in various cities. Istanbul is one, of course, Mumbai is another. Especially at this moment, I think in time, it's quite pertinent in terms of the workshop that we're doing on public space and the general work that Studio-X has done over the last 2.5 years in various cities around the world. I don't know if many of you know anything about Studio-X. I'll explain it a little bit later. I just wanted to kind of introduce it in the beginning. But I wanted to introduce and talk about 3 projects today in reference to somehow spanning the gamut between the public space workshop, the city bit, which is what we're here in Istanbul for this week, and which we'll be traveling to Mumbai for next week for the last and final leg. But also projects that deal with, I think, just urban research and how different disciplines are able to kind of connect to cities, not just architecture and urban design, but sometimes it's art, sometimes it's public policy. There are different forms of criticism which come up, and those are all things that I think Studio-X starts to kind of engage in a very positive way. So the title of my lecture is Urban Public Art Space, and I don't know if many of you know Mumbai or have been to Mumbai. I mean, this is one of the original drawings of the city. And it was originally formed from 7 islands. And later on, when the British were occupying Bombay, they filled in the mid-1800s, they filled in all the islands in between to make what is today known as the city of Mumbai and its greater metropolitan region. So the dots indicate the 7 islands where they originally were, and all the space more or less in between, a large chunk of it, is all reclaimed land. This is the actual Google map of it, so you can see it's fairly close to what's there. If you see where it says next to Bandra, there's a huge water body to the right of that. That has also all been filled in. That's where the airport and a lot of the suburbs of Mumbai are today. But far from that beauty that everybody talks about in terms of what Mumbai is and the the history of Mumbai and the dynamism. They're also the realities which urban researchers and other organizations like Studio-X and Studio-X are dealing with. And these are the realities of development, of very fast growth and development which is sometimes thought of as uncontrollable. These are just some general Google Maps you can see of different areas which were developed over time and how their planning strategies actually differ and make different components of the city. These are, for example, suburbs in the north, traditionally planned as single unit bungalows and villas, now becoming all kind of high-rise residential buildings. And the reality is something very, sometimes it's something very scary. We see it in the news a little bit, just as I see the news on what's happening in Istanbul from Mumbai. I might be a little bit detached, but I understand what's going on. The reality in Mumbai is of dichotomies. On left, you have the famous, Antilla residential tower belonging to the industrialist family Ambani. 4 people, father, mother, and 2 children, are the owners of this house. Of course, there are 200 other people who live in the building, but they all service those 4 people. 5 levels of parking and cinemas and gyms and all, but basically a family of 4 lives there. So these are the kind of development strategies which the government is implementing in a city like Mumbai, which go via the guidelines. But at the end of the day, once we have a kind of product and we see the product, we notice that that product is unequitable. We have an image on the right, which is of Dharavi, which is the, which I'll talk about more later in one of the projects I'm going to discuss. This is the recycling center specifically, but Dharavi again, a zone of the city which has at least 1 million plus inhabitants, and in itself is a mini industrialized residential living organism unit, self-sufficient. A lot of the things that happen in Mumbai happen in places like Dharavi or Dharavi itself. And then you have natural calamities, which of course affect the city in many different ways. And this one was of the floods that happened several years ago, which kind of handicapped the city and debilitated most of the urban population. Regardless of whether you were rich, whether you were poor, everybody was affected. These are the realities of development, of equitable living, of transport, of safe, providing of safe resources like drinking water and sanitation. These are all the issues that the city is dealing with. The famous flyovers of Mumbai, which are the highways which are built on top of the roads because they were thought to alleviate traffic but just increase the double the density of vehicles within those areas. So there are veritably there are failed attempts at understanding what urban infrastructure is and understanding the needs of the people. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm quite enamored by the level of public infrastructure and transportation that you have in Istanbul, and the ability for people to kind of use public transport is quite amazing. These are things that cities like Mumbai also require. The very expensive areas of Mumbai, I mean, this is actually Worli. This is called Worli area, and if you see to the right, there's this tower up here. That's the Four Seasons. It's the Four Seasons Hotel in Mumbai. And the Four Seasons looks down on the settlement, which is the informal settlement that is right nearby. And so you're talking about increasingly distinct levels of living and equitability in terms of economics, finance, resources, living in the closest proximity, dependent upon one another. I'm pretty much sure that the hotel relies on that settlement for many of its resources and needs in terms of maybe laundries and supplies and deliveries. So they cannot be divorced from one another. They are intimately connected. On the left is actually Dharavi. That's one kind of plan of Dharavi, and in between are the railway lines that divide the east and west of the city. On the right is one of the oldest residential neighborhoods in Sion, which is a beautiful neighborhood full of trees, but the amount of people that walk over this little bridge, if you see there's a little bridge over here, that little bridge in the morning, if you go there at 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, and you are trying to cross that side, where all the people from Dharavi are trying to get out, it's impossible. You just won't make it across because you have thousands of people going on for about an hour just moving across that bridge. So there's a huge importance in understanding the relationship between these things. We have also what's happening in the name of development, what's happening in the name of giving people something better, a better future. The settlements, which you see, this is actually a settlement that was torn down recently in the last 6 months. So I happened to just be able to get into that site. You'll see some of the buildings which are still there, which they could not tear down because they didn't have the rights to at that moment. But you see the bulldozers pulling it down, and you see what they're building in place of that. So from this kind of horizontal village or community, which works as a mini village within the city, you're getting these vertical high-rise towers which don't work for the people and inhabitants. So basically, what I'm trying to get at is that we're developing so fast without really thinking about what we want in the future, and that's a question that we're basically asking ourselves. So this slide actually is quite interesting because these are also informal settlements. These are up north towards Nalasopara, which is a suburb outside of the lower city limits. It's in another municipality called Thane district, and it's north of the creek. So it's quite far away, but it's very cheap for people to live. So many of the people who they commute back and forth between the north and the south for work. They live up in Nalasopara because accommodation is cheap, and they're able to afford rentals and owning houses also. But what's interesting about this is if you see how the settlement was actually formed, the settlement was formed in this kind of very rational grid. And you'll also see very particular need for an open space, which nobody encroaches upon. So the community itself starts to form things like these open spaces, which become gathering points for the community. I would say that in most settlements and in terms of the research, that those things are very sacrosanct, that they're not taken advantage of, and usually they're understood as a common interest of the settlement. So the settlement is, it's not chaotic, actually. I mean, in my experience, it's not chaotic. It's well formed, it's well understood. The problem is that it is outside of the convention of what the government feels is correct, outside of the convention of what the private players within Mumbai feel is correct. But at some point, regardless of that, they're still communities. So whether they live in informal settlements or slums or vertical towers with only 3 meters or 2.5 meters of open space between them, we still have to find a solution, because if we don't find a solution, then it's going to be a larger problem. So how does Studio-X play a role in this? Mumbai is full of institutions and agencies and not-for-profits, that NGOs, that are looking at urban development. They look at urban development from the planning and policy side. They look at urban development from the activist side, from the local NGO side, from the communities themselves, from grassroots level organizations. But there are not many organizations within the city that want to try to span the gamut of disciplines that engage themselves with the cities. And that's what, in my role in the last 2.5 years, and these are just some of the kind of agencies and people that we've kind of worked with on projects, on exhibitions, on lectures, workshops, community meetings, activist meetings regarding planning policy. And that's, for me, that's the most important part of what Studio-X does there. It just allows this very open engagement and kind of cross-disciplinary dialogue between different agencies, not saying that one agency is absolutely critical for the development, but there are multiple agencies that can kind of get together and form a kind of opinion. They can form a resolution. They can engage in discussion, and that allows the space to be, in a way, quite neutral. I mean, it's neutral in its stance of opening its doors, but then it could become also quite pointed and specific in terms of engaging in final resolution or product. So we have lots of so these are some of the images that I've just kind of put together of, well, you have construction and you have infrastructure, and of course you have the trains and the floods. You have the beautiful people of Mumbai, who are some of the most lovely in the world. You have the settlements, and you have this kind of chaotic planning. So Studio-X basically, I mean, through its programming and through its events and through the way it kind of thinks about the city, tries to create quite a wide gamut of projects and exhibitions and talks and workshops that allow us to engage in these kind of questions, but look at them from various perspectives. So tonight I just want to talk about 3 projects, and they're all kind of dealing with public space in a way, or at least the public kind of perspective on urban space. But they're looking at them from different, I guess, contexts. One of the projects is a project that's purely executed in the public realm. It was conceived, drawn out, executed everything in a public space during a specific moment in time. Another project was purely conceived of in the studio itself. It was a kind of a gallery opening for an artist that worked with us on some projects. And then another one which was researched in the public space and then finally discussed in an open forum within the kind of hermetic space of Studio-X. So the first project is Unprepared. So Unprepared was really the best name for this because we were really unprepared for what we got at the end of the day in terms of what we understood from the workshop. And this was a workshop that was initiated by Droog Design in Amsterdam, which they have a series of labs which work on different projects every year. And this year, in terms of kind of innovation and ideas, and this year, the past year, the workshop was based in Mumbai. So they were interested in looking at a series of questions. And the questions were having to do with, of course, urbanity, but probably more dealing with design, because Droog is, of course, one of the leaders in product design, graphic design in the world. They were interested in how Mumbai could somehow give them a kind of impetus or a new understanding of how they would look at design. So that was the real question. It was, what is the future of design? And I mean, it was, there was Droog Design, of course, there was Rennie Ramakers, there was Bas Prinsen, who is an architectural photographer, who was leading the discussion. We had local architects, D-Coop. We had, I don't know if any of you know of Herb's work, which is Rahul Srivastava and Matthias Ekinove. They work on a project that's called User-Generated Cities. So their office is based in Dharavi itself, and they work with local communities, kind of generate projects and all within the local community. And then we had graphic designers and product designers from all over India. sitting on a kind of common collaborative project that lasted about 10 days. So the idea was, okay, what is the future of design and where are we going to find this in Mumbai? So everybody was questioning, okay, should we be looking downtown? Should we be looking in the markets? Should we be looking in the old areas, or should we be going to the suburbs where the industry has shifted? And eventually the easiest, I think, answer to that was to go straight to Dharavi. I mean, I know that it sounds like Dharavi, everybody says Dharavi is the place to go, but it is itself a little city, a mini city that can execute everything from A to Z in one place. So the idea was to go to Dharavi and then figure out how to make them answer this question, what is the future of design, without asking them the question, what is the future of design, because they would not be able to answer it in that way. So what we did was we searched the city for ideas and said, okay, can we redesign this, or can we do this, or what's lacking, what do we do? And everybody agreed that was just impossible. There's no way to tell them, okay, let's redesign this and let's say if you can do it in a better way. We just said, let's pick something random, and the most random thing, but it had to be connected to India in some way. So we were just looking at like Indian diagrams, just typing it in the computer and looking on Google and all, and this mathematician came up, and this mathematician's basic diagrams, which were these simple line drawings explaining how to measure distances between points A, B, C, D. And we said, oh, this is great. Let's just pick this diagram, and let's see if this diagram can spawn something within the context of what we wanted to do. So that was the initial start. It had nothing to do with anybody. It didn't have to do with Bombay specifically. It just had to do with giving us something that everybody was placed on the same platform in a neutral ground. The top product designers, they didn't know anything else. We architects, we didn't know anything. The people who were producing in Dharavi, they weren't going to know anything. So everybody was kind of at a level playing field. So we went to Dharavi, and these are some images. These are the backs of the houses on the waterways, which are called the nalas. These are anywhere from recycling centers, which recycle all the plastics, metal boxes, which are the oil tins that people carry cooking oil in. These also get recycled. Plastic chairs, metal, anything that you can think of is pretty much recycled, and most of it is done in Dharavi itself. It's broken down into its components, and it's resold back to the same industries as pellets or small metal pieces or sheets, or molten into things like that. So we went there and we said, okay, well, let's give them the diagram, and that's what we did. We just gave them the diagram, and 2 days later, it was actually quite interesting how different vendors, like the cloth maker, the tailor, the printer, the metal fabricator, the person who does drawings. You can actually take, like, let's say if you wanted to make a print for a dress or something, you can just do a sketch, and there'll be a guy who sits there with a ruler and pencil, and he'll just make your drawing proper, and then he'll put it into he'll get it cut into like a silk screen or this or that. And so they're all these amazing technicians. They're technicians, they're craftspeople. And they started just producing their ideas. And then after a couple of days, once they produced it, we went back to them and say, okay, is this it? Is this all we could do? And they said, yes, this is what you asked for. This is what we're doing. And I said, no, can you do anything else? Can you tell us about what it is that we're giving you? Can you tell us something else? So they kept on working, and they kept on working. I'm not going to say that we have an answer. I still don't know what the question of the future of design is, but we did come up with very interesting, ways of looking at of the question, and ways of them interpreting through their medium what we kind of wanted. You had kite makers who were making three-dimensional kites. Of course, they had problem flying, but that's not the point. They enjoyed it. They said, no, we can't do it. We can't make a kite that looks like this. It's not symmetrical, it won't fly. I said, okay, can you try? No, we can't do it. And then after sitting in there and looking at our poor faces for many hours, they finally said, okay, let us try. And amazingly, they got really into it afterwards. And initially, it's a very funny story. When we first went to the kite maker, they pretended as if they didn't speak English. They just spoke Hindi to us, and the people who were there from the Netherlands, they were speaking to them, and they're saying, nahi, 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 nahi kar sakte, nahi kar sakte. Eventually, after a few hours of seeing us sitting there and really painstakingly looking at this crazy kites that they were making, they started speaking English, and they started. So we kind of broke some barriers there, which they were very happy to eventually be part of a project like this. Yeah, and eventually what we did was we invited the vendors who came, which is quite amazing because spaces like Studio-X or art galleries don't normally get a crowd of, you know, a certain type of people who don't come because that's not of their interest. But they did come for this because their products were being displayed there. The craft that they had made, which they weren't able to sell, they didn't really understand why it was made. They came and they sat in the discussion, which was quite, for us, it was quite interesting. So we had this kind of round table. We had all the products that we produced. Even people who, in the center, it's called a chakri, which is a thing to eat. It's like a crispy food. So even the guy who was cooking food had this diagram, and he was making stuff. So that was all there. Okay, the second project is the project that's conceived kind of hermetically within the space. This was called Happy Owners, and it was done in conjunction with a French artist named Soazic Guezenek. Soazic came to me with this idea that she wanted to look at architecture's relationship to landscape and nature. And it was, for me, it was very interesting because these are all questions that we ask for we ask about in terms of future development. There are mangroves that are being destroyed. There are people who are cutting down trees at will. The issue with Gezi Park, of course, that was also, you know, comes into play. Like, how can you just remove all the trees to put up a building? So these are issues that are very common, not only, I guess, in Istanbul, but in Mumbai itself. So she wanted to explore this. So we came up with this idea of why doesn't she design these projects as if they're real, but they're all fake projects. They're marketed just as any developer or builder would market them. And then we'll just make a kind of pseudo-fake office in Studio-X, and we'll just try and sell the projects in whichever way we could. And through selling the projects, obviously someone would not be able to buy a flat in a building like this, but we were trying to sell processes, for example. So how could one person make their existing flat or building green? So we would have local agencies that work in Mumbai that have, for example, like urban farming. They would come, then they would give workshops to the people who are coming to the exhibition to say, okay, if you want to spend this much, you can make your house into an urban landscape. So we started to work on this, and we had an exhibition, which was the opening of the office, actually, and it was called Subjective Architecture Realty, and talked about real estate company giving nature the city it deserves was our kind of byline. And we created a series of images and brochures and, you know, proper literature as if we were selling real projects within the city. I'm sure, I don't know about the property market in Istanbul, but I know the property market in Mumbai is quite buoyant, and it usually consists of these outrageous images of buildings and people living with swimming pools on their decks, and there's like nothing around. There's no other building around, there are no people around, it's just in the middle of a forest, which is absolutely untrue. So we did similar images, but we understood, like, for example, Celestial Mountains. Celestial Mountains was building on the mountains of Mumbai. There are several hills within the urban precinct of Mumbai, but then there are also slums which kind of blanket the spaces and the valleys in between. Oceanopolis was looking at the water bodies of Mumbai and seeing if those areas could be consumed through these types of spaces. These are typical high-rises, which then become these beautiful cascading waterfalls. Yeah, we had the Magic Mushrooms project, which was a big hit. And then we constructed a series of things in the spaces, also working with local students, kind of installations which talked about important things in the city, like for example, these are the tins I showed you earlier in Dharavi, which are kind of integral for delivering, as a delivering mechanism for oil, cooking oil. But we use that as a kind of structure to develop this kind of very elaborate garden, which would then be, which would be maintained by one of the urban farming agencies, Fresh and Local is their name. And so we had an exhibition of a lot of drawings, and you know, the opening was great. I mean, we had a lot of interest in terms of the work that was being done, but what was more interesting, I think, at the end was the series of workshops that we had continuously going on for the month that the exhibition was on. And this not only had adults coming to it, but it had a lot of young students, you know, elementary school students coming and drawing and imagining what they thought of, what they thought Mumbai or city should be, a city that looks at urban development and looks at nature. These are some of the workshops on the left, the students sitting in the space and working with, drawing their ideas and questions on the city. We had a map also, which was also fun for the kids. We had this map in which we put two sets of armies on opposite side, one with the army of development and the other one with the army of nature. And so these kids just had a great blast, just kind of playing around with them and seeing who's going to eventually win. And the last project I'm going to show this evening is called Privacy Please. This was also done in conjunction with a local artist, a German artist named Tobias Megerle. We conceived the project basically because Tobias was doing a series of residencies within Mumbai. He always wanted to do something with Studio-X, and the BMW Guggenheim Lab was coming to Mumbai. In January of this year they were there, and they offered us a space in a public space which they were getting approval from the government to kind of build their structures in. So we took advantage of that. We said, it's great, we'll do it as part of the lab. And so what we did was we built and designed a kind of structure which would question the nature and the relationship of public and private space within the city. And I'm sure you can't see what our structure is because it's quite anonymous. It's in there somewhere. But this is one of the public spaces that the lab occupied for the period of the 1 week that they were there. This is actually a beach. This is technically a beach in Mumbai, which is more like a dirty parking lot. It's in Mahim, which is Mahim Bay. And it's used for several different things. It's used as a fairground. It's used as a spot for parking trucks. As you see, different vehicles are also parked there. It's also the access to the water in the bay. So there's a fishing community, the traditional Koliwada community that lives there. So they use the space to kind of catch fish and bring the fish into the local markets. They're bamboo sellers. I don't know if I don't know how, I think here you have proper scaffolding, but in Bombay, 90% of the scaffolding is made of bamboo for all the buildings, even high rises. So there's a huge bamboo market, so everybody gets their bamboo from Mahim. So we thought it would be interesting, okay, we wanted to build something, but we didn't know exactly what it was, and we also didn't have any budget, hardly anything to build. I think maybe around $600–700 we had. So we said, why don't we use the bamboo from the local market? That's the easiest. We don't have to do any transportation, and it's also very kind of contextual. So we just decided to build this bamboo structure. And this just gives you a little bit of context of what the space is like. So this is the structure that we made. Those are the bamboo markets on this side. So these are taking bamboo to different development sites within the city. And this is where the lab itself had set up its main structure along the water. So you'll see a bunch of people very interested in what's going on there. And those are the Koliwadas, which are the fishing villages. The fishing village community is on the right side over here. And this is also a playground. This is a recreation area for the kids and the people of the community. So we built the structure in one day by just buying the bamboo in the morning and then just getting a team of local craftsmen to help us tie the bamboo together and put it up on site. And what we basically were interested in exploring was the fact that within a public space that has so many things, it just didn't seem like anybody was doing anything, very interactive. There were all separate things going on. They were all kind of independent events. And we just wanted to, in some simple way, create a moment which just made people ask a question, what is that sitting there in the space? And that's exactly what it did. Everybody that saw it thought first that it was a pile of bamboo from the market. But then as they came closely and they saw, we actually hooked up a computer inside, a laptop. And we, through simple DOS programming, we set a series of questions that people could answer. So people would enter the structure. They would sit there on a very nice, it was actually quite a nice space. We were hanging out in there for quite a bit. But they would be in this interiorized space in a huge public space. And they would feel very, very comfortable sitting there in that little bamboo structure. And that actually told us a lot about also the intimacy that people feel in Mumbai about what their public space is, what their private space is, that sometimes private space is really as close as a minor division of what you could see through a set of bamboo still feels like private space. So people would go and sit at that terminal, and they would answer these questions. So what is public space? What is private space? Does private space exist in Mumbai? What is your ideal public space? And they would answer these questions, and we logged all this and then posted these answers online. There were also tutorials for people who felt maybe there was a limitation, maybe they didn't understand how to use the computer. We had kind of tutorials of people who could come in, sit with them, and they would actually teach them how to type in their answers to the machine. And this was one of the outputs, which was just a simple screen, which people could actually see what was happening on the inside of what people were typing on the inside of the space. They would see that input, that output directly on the monitor outside. So, I mean, I think from the artist's point of view and from Studio-X's point of view, there were a lot of interesting things we were playing with, which was the idea that one also has to sit within that little interior space and use a kind of technology to give the answer to somebody who's sitting outside versus just the kind of normal interaction that you would see maybe in, for example, in Istanbul, which I see a lot of people asking questions on, what are our rights in terms of public space. Here, sometimes people don't understand that you have a right to that type of space. You have a right to be able to use a park, or to have a space that is not, say, taken over by a fair at will, or a private entity occupying that space, or retail sellers using that there was a right for them to use that public space. And that space on the development plan of Mumbai it's a beach. It's a public beach. It's a government beach. So it's being abused basically at will. So the idea was to ask these questions and to get people interested in seeing how they would be able to answer these questions. And of course, we had a lot of strange answers, but we had also some ones that kind of told us a little bit more about what we were looking for. So just to close, and there will be a Studio-X. It's opening officially. Selva is going to be the director. She's sitting right there. So I really, I'm sure you guys will be using it. I have no doubt. But I implore that a space like that in a city is an added value. And in Mumbai, I think it's been a struggle for 2.5 years to make it a space where people feel comfortable. But for me, it's been a very challenging role to kind of curate people's questions, to kind of curate these interactions, and to not always know what you're going to get. I think that's the fantastic thing about a space like Studio-X. Thank you. Anybody have any questions? Or yes, Jeff.
Can you wait just a second so we can record?
So the image you showed of Mumbai, the grid with the couple of tiles that were open.
Right.
It seems like I was curious about how that grid came to be. Is it the government lays down a grid and then just kind of walks away from it because that's what it appears to be?
No, not necessarily. I mean, there are a lot of these kind of urban settlements, and many of them are like transit-oriented. They're called transit camps. They're actually displacements of people from the original settlement. They put them in these temporary camps until the redevelopment authority makes these, what they're called slum rehabilitation authority, makes these new buildings for them to live in. So many of these things are kind of planned in a very governmental way, but some of these are self-formed. The reason why you see some of it somewhat of a chaotic, organic growth in many of these projects is that they all kind of navigate and orient themselves according to certain important features of the city. So you'll see most settlements are located on water bodies. They'll always be located on a canal or a kind of a waterway or a bay or an ocean or a seafront, because water is a very integral component of how they can live. If they don't have that, then where do you go to the bathroom? Where do you get water to wash clothes? I mean, these are all kind of standard. So then organically, depending on the landmass and where the locality, that'll form in that organic way. In places like Nalasapara, honestly, there's nothing. There's just like land. And so these things are formed in the most rational and simple way, and they're allotted in those kind of organizations. So it depends on where the settlement is. Actually, it's maybe more geographical. Any other questions? Okay, thanks.